The cassette tape clicked once before his voice came through. Calm, measured, familiar. If you're hearing this, it means Evelyn finally gave you the letter. I stopped breathing for a second. The bank office around me suddenly felt too small. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, a fake plant in the corner beside the printer. The young employee outside the glass door was laughing softly at something on her phone. And my dead father was speaking directly into my ears. I told her to wait until after the funeral. My hand tightened around the tape player. She never liked following my instructions. I stared at the rows of documents spread across the table in front of me. Photos. Receipts. Letters. A stack of property tax statements from a town 3 hours north of Columbus. And one photograph sitting face down beside the tape recorder. I still hadn't turned it over. Not yet. Because somewhere deep down, I already knew my life had divided itself into two versions. Before this room. And after it. The funeral had been less than 24 hours earlier. St. Matthew's looked exactly the same as it had during every wedding, baptism, and Easter service of my childhood. Dark wooden pews, white lilies near the altar, women from my mother's old church circle whispering beside the coffee station. The same casseroles probably waited in refrigerators across town. That was how people mourned in our suburb. Quietly, efficiently. My father would have appreciated the organization. People loved him publicly. That became obvious the moment I walked through the church doors. Men from his investment firm shook my hand too firmly. Women touched my arm with polished sympathy. Everyone described him the same way. Disciplined. Reliable. Respected. No one said warm. No one said gentle. I noticed that immediately. My younger brother Daniel handled most of the conversations. He had always been better at performing emotional normalcy. He wore my father's navy overcoat. It fit him perfectly. That bothered me more than it should have. "You holding up okay?" he asked quietly before the service started. I nodded. "I'm fine." He studied me for a second. "You don't have to do that today." "Do what?" "Pretend you're not angry." I looked away before answering. "I'm not angry." But even I heard the lie. My father and I had spent years speaking carefully around each other. Never fighting outright. Never resolving anything either. By the end, our conversation sounded like professional emails spoken aloud. Polite. Controlled. Emotionally sterile. The strangest part was that nobody else seemed to notice. Or maybe they did. Maybe families simply learned to survive around certain absences. Evelyn arrived 10 minutes before the service. My stepmother moved slowly now. Not fragile exactly, just deliberate. Her gray coat hung loosely around her shoulders, and she kept adjusting the leather gloves in her hands without putting them on. People immediately surrounded her. Churchwomen. Neighbors. My father's golf friends. Everyone wanted proximity to the widow. Status didn't disappear after death, it simply changed shape. Evelyn thanked people softly. Touched hands. Accepted casseroles. Accepted condolences. Accepted admiration. Then her eyes found mine across the lobby. Something shifted in her expression. Not grief. Decision. During the final hymn, I noticed she wasn't singing. She was watching the closed casket. Almost cautiously. Like she no longer trusted the man inside it. After the burial, everyone gathered in the fellowship hall downstairs. Paper cups. Ham sandwiches? Potato salad sweating beneath fluorescent lights. My father would have hated every minute of it. Daniel stood beside two men from the firm discussing estate logistics. Not inheritance directly, but close enough. I heard phrases like portfolio transition and temporary leadership structure. People always revealed themselves around money, especially after funerals. Evelyn touched my elbow lightly. "Could you help me with something outside?" Her voice was steady. Too steady. We walked toward the empty side parking lot beside the church offices. Wind moved through the bare trees near the fence line. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she reached into her purse. The envelope was cream-colored and sealed with clear tape. My name sat across the front in my father's handwriting. Not typed. Handwritten. That alone unsettled me. "Your father left instructions," she said. I stared at the envelope. "What is this?" "Read it alone." That's not really an answer. No. She looked toward the church windows. It isn't. I waited for more explanation. None came. You knew about this, I asked. Her jaw tightened slightly. I knew enough. Enough for what? She looked at me then. Really looked at me. And suddenly she seemed older than she had inside the church. Not physically. Emotionally. Like someone who had spent years carrying a heavy object nobody else could see. Your father cared very much about appearances, she said quietly. I almost laughed. That was the understatement of the century. He thought he could organize people the same way he organized finances. What does that mean? It means he believed control and love were the same thing. Wind rattled the dead leaves near our shoes. I didn't answer. Neither did she. Then she placed the envelope into my hands, and for one strange second her fingers closed around mine. Almost apologetically. You may hate me after you read it, she said. I don't hate you now. That's because you still think your father was protecting this family. Something cold moved through my chest. What's in here? Her eyes watered instantly. Not dramatically. Just sudden exhausted moisture she seemed embarrassed by. The truth, she said. Then she walked back toward the church without another word. I sat in my car for almost 40 minutes before opening the envelope. Rain started halfway through. Small drops at first. Then heavier against the windshield. Inside was a handwritten letter. And beneath it a separate card containing numbers. A safe deposit box code. My father's handwriting remained painfully recognizable. Sharp. Precise. Controlled. Even his secrets looked organized. The confession itself was short. Too short. Your father had another responsibility for many years. One I agreed to keep private. He believed secrecy protected everyone involved. After his death, I no longer believe silence serves any purpose. The box contains everything. I read those lines 6 times. Another responsibility. That was the phrase she chose. Not affair. Not betrayal. Not family. Responsibility. I leaned back against the seat and closed my eyes. Outside, people were still leaving the church parking lot. Cars moved slowly through rainwater. Windshield wipers passing back and forth. Normal life continuing. Meanwhile, my own memories had started rearranging themselves without permission. Every missed birthday dinner. Every business trip. Every emotionally distant conversation. Every moment I thought my father simply preferred work over family. Maybe none of it meant what I believed. Or maybe it meant exactly what I feared. I drove home in silence. The letter sat on the passenger seat beside me. At a red light, I picked it up again. There was one final line at the bottom I hadn't noticed before. He wanted you to know eventually. Not because he trusted you. Because he believed you could survive it. I stared at those words for a long time. Then the light turned green. I didn't move immediately. The driver behind me honked once. Sharp. Impatient. I pressed the gas pedal slowly. And for the first time since my father died, I realized grief was not the heaviest thing he left behind. I almost turned around twice on the drive to the bank. The first time was at a gas station outside Dayton. The second was in the parking garage itself. Neither felt like fear exactly. More like resistance. Like some quiet part of me already understood that once I opened the safe deposit box, my father would stop being a memory and become a person. Real people were harder to forgive. The bank occupied the ground floor of an office building near the riverfront. Not flashy, just expensive in a restrained Midwestern way. Polished stone floors. Muted artwork. Retirement brochures arranged in careful rows. My father trusted places like this. Institutions with controlled temperatures and neutral carpeting. Places where secrets stayed organized. The woman at the reception desk smiled professionally when I gave my name. Mr. Whitmore left access authorization for you. That sentence landed strangely. Left access authorization. Like he had planned this moment down to the wording. She led me through a secured hallway toward the private viewing rooms. Her heels clicked softly against the tile. You can take as much time as you need, she said. I nodded. I probably won't be long. But even then, I knew I was lying. The box itself was smaller than I expected. Plain metal. No dramatic weight to it. The employee placed it carefully on the table before leaving me alone. The room went silent after the door shut. Not complete silence. Ventilation hum. Distant printer noise. My own breathing. I entered the code from Evelyn's note with slightly shaking fingers. Then I opened the box. At first, nothing inside looked shocking. Folders. Envelopes. Old photographs held together with paper clips. One cassette tape. A leather-bound check register. For several seconds, I simply stared. My pulse slowed unexpectedly. I almost felt disappointed. Then I picked up the first photograph. A woman stood beside an old blue pickup truck outside what looked like a rural grocery store. Late 40s, maybe. Dark hair pulled back loosely, no makeup, one hand shielding her eyes from sunlight. Beside her stood a teenage boy. Tall. Thin. Dark jacket zipped halfway. And smiling with my father's exact smile. I froze. Not resemblance. Recognition. The kind your body notices before your brain accepts it. My father's smile had always appeared unexpectedly youthful compared to the rest of him, almost boyish. It softened his entire face. This boy had the same smile. Exactly the same. I slowly turned over the photograph. July 2011, Marlene and Caleb. No explanation. No last names. My stomach tightened. I reached for another photograph. Then another. Birthdays. Fishing trips. A high school graduation. The same woman. The same boy. And my father standing in the background of several images, always slightly apart from the others. Not distant. Careful. Like someone visiting another version of his life. I sat down slowly. The room suddenly felt warmer. I opened one of the folders. Inside were years of financial statements. Tuition payments. Medical bills. Mortgage assistance. Monthly transfers from one of my father's private accounts. Consistent. Meticulous. Nearly 19 years. 19. I pressed my fingers against my forehead. Daniel had once joked that Dad treated spreadsheets more affectionately than people. At the time, we laughed. Now the joke felt different. Because apparently my father had been supporting another household with the same quiet discipline he used managing investment portfolios. No missed payments. No emotional mess. Even betrayal had been carefully budgeted. I didn't realize I was crying until a tear landed on one of the bank statements. I wiped it away immediately. Reflex. My mother used to say our family treated emotions like embarrassing interruptions. Keep your voice level. Keep moving. Handle things privately. My father perfected that philosophy. Maybe he inherited it himself. Or maybe successful men simply received rewards for emotional absence. I looked back at the photographs. Caleb appeared older in each one. At 16, he wore braces. At 18, a baseball cap. At 21, hospital scrubs beside what looked like a nursing school ceremony. Meanwhile, I was remembering my own 20s. Student loans. 2 jobs. Phone calls from my father asking if I had a long-term strategy. Never once offering financial help. Not once. A sharp laugh escaped me before I could stop it. The sound startled me. Because it didn't sound angry. It sounded wounded. That was worse. I opened the leather check register next. Each entry had small notes beside the payments. Caleb textbooks. Marlene surgery deposit. Winter utilities. Apartment repair. Brief. Practical. But strangely intimate. I kept reading. Then one note stopped me cold. Caleb doesn't know. I stared at those 3 words for a long time. Doesn't know what? That my father supported them. That he was his father. Or that he wasn't. I suddenly realized I had already decided Caleb was my half-brother without actual proof. Because emotionally it fit too neatly. Successful suburban father. Secret second family. Neglected daughter. People understood stories like that instantly. Especially women. Especially daughters. I reached for the cassette tape but stopped myself. Not yet. I wasn't ready to hear his voice. Instead, I opened another envelope. Inside were handwritten letters from Marlene. Most were ordinary. Updates about bills. Medical appointments. Caleb's grades. But one letter felt different immediately. The handwriting shook slightly. I read it twice. I know you think protecting them means lying to everyone, but children always feel the truth eventually, even when nobody says it aloud. I leaned back in the chair. My chest felt hollow now. Not explosive grief. Not cinematic betrayal. Something quieter. Like years of confusion finally discovering their source. My father never hit us. Never screamed. Never abandoned the family physically. From the outside, he looked almost ideal. Good income. Reliable schedule. Church attendance every Sunday. College funds. Retirement planning. Perfect lawn. But sitting inside that little bank room, I understood something I had avoided for most of my adult life. A person could fulfill every responsibility and still leave emotional damage behind. Sometimes the absence itself became the wound. I picked up one final photograph. This one included my father directly. No distance. No careful positioning. He sat beside Caleb at a diner booth, both laughing at something outside the frame. Completely relaxed. I had seen my father smile before. But never like that. Never unguarded. Something inside me shifted then. Not jealousy exactly. Grief. For the relationship we almost had. I looked at the timestamp printed in the corner. October 2014. 3 days before he missed my graduate school ceremony because of an important client emergency. I closed my eyes, and suddenly I could hear my mother defending him all over again. Your father works hard for this family. He's under pressure. He shows love differently. Maybe she believed those things. Maybe she needed to. I checked my phone. 3 missed calls from Daniel. 1 text. You okay? I stared at the message without replying. Because for the first time in my life I genuinely didn't know how to answer that question. Before leaving, I finally picked up the cassette tape. My father's handwriting covered the label. For Elena only. Not the family. Not Evelyn. Me. That frightened me more than everything else inside the box. I slipped the tape carefully into my purse. Then locked the safe again. The employee met me outside the room. Everything all right? She asked politely. I opened my mouth. Paused. Then smiled automatically. Yes, I said. The lie came out effortlessly. Just like it always had in my family. I didn't listen to the tape that night. I placed it on my kitchen counter beside unopened mail and left it there for hours. Like proximity alone might explain it. Outside, snow drifted softly across the cul-de-sac. My neighborhood looked painfully normal. Porch lights, recycling bins, a teenager jogging with headphones despite the cold. Meanwhile, my father's second life sat 15 feet away from my coffee maker. I poured wine I didn't want, then reheated leftovers I never touched. Around 10 o'clock, Daniel called again. This time I answered. You disappeared today, he said. I had errands. At a bank. I froze. How do you know that? Evelyn mentioned you stopped by Dad's branch office. Of course she had. Not carelessly either. Intentionally. I leaned against the kitchen counter. What exactly did she tell you? That you were handling some paperwork. Paperwork. Interesting choice. She didn't say anything else. No, a pause. Should she have? I looked toward the cassette tape. No. Daniel exhaled quietly. You sound strange. I'm tired. You want company. The offer caught me off guard. My brother and I had never been emotionally demonstrative people. We cared in indirect ways, loaning tools, forwarding job openings, remembering birthdays through calendar reminders. But not conversations like this. I'm okay, I said. Another lie. He didn't challenge it. Mom would have hated all this funeral stuff, he said softly. That surprised me too. We rarely mentioned our mother directly anymore. She hated casseroles, I said. Daniel laughed once under his breath. She hated church basement coffee. And those tiny butter packets. Yeah. Silence settled between us. Comfortable for a few seconds. Then not. You think Dad was happy? He asked suddenly. The question landed hard because I already knew the answer was complicated. I think Dad was efficient, I said carefully. Daniel laughed again. This time without humor. Same thing. I don't know. After we hung up, I stared at the tape recorder for a long time. Then I turned the kitchen lights off and went to bed without listening. The next morning I drove north. I told myself I only wanted answers, but somewhere deeper I think I wanted contradiction. I wanted to meet someone cruel enough to simplify my feelings. An obvious mistress. A manipulator. Someone easy to blame. Instead, I found a small town wrapped in winter fog. Marlene's address led me to a modest ranch-style home near an old railroad crossing. The siding needed paint. Wind chimes moved gently beside the porch. No hidden luxury. No secret mansion funded by my father. Just ordinary life. I almost drove away. Then the front door opened before I reached it. Marlene recognized me immediately. I could tell by her face. Not shock. Recognition. Like she had been waiting years for this exact moment. "Elena," she said quietly. Hearing my name from her mouth unsettled me. "You know who I am?" Yes. Neither of us moved at first. Finally, she stepped aside. "It's cold out there." Inside smelled faintly like cinnamon and laundry detergent. Family photographs covered one hallway wall. Not expensive frames, just accumulated years. Normal years. Marlene motioned toward the kitchen table. "You look like your mother." That sentence tightened something inside me immediately. "You knew my mother too?" "No." She sat carefully. "But your father carried her photo for years." I didn't answer. She folded her hands together slowly. There was no glamour to her, no performance, just visible exhaustion around the eyes. And guilt. A quiet, settled guilt that had clearly lived there a long time. "I almost didn't come," I admitted. "I know. You expected me." "Eventually." I looked around the kitchen. Bills stacked neatly near the refrigerator. Prescription bottles beside the sink. A calendar filled with handwritten reminders. Again, painfully ordinary. Not the secret fantasy I had imagined during the drive. "Were you sleeping with my father?" I asked finally. Marlene looked down immediately. Then back at me. "No." The answer came too quickly to sound rehearsed. I frowned. "Then what exactly was he doing here?" She inhaled slowly before speaking. "Saving us." That irritated me instantly. My father wasn't exactly known for emotional heroics. "I know." "Then explain it to me." Marlene nodded slightly. "Fair enough." She stood and retrieved a small folder from the counter. Inside were medical records. Old insurance denials. Surgery estimates. I scanned the documents quickly. Cancer treatment. 20 years ago. "I got sick when Caleb was little," she said quietly. "Very sick." I kept reading. "Your father handled pension investments for the factory where I worked. When I lost insurance, he found out. And decided to financially adopt you." The bitterness in my voice sounded sharp even to me. Marlene accepted it without reacting. "He helped because nobody else would." I looked at her. "You expect me to believe my father secretly funded another household for 2 decades out of kindness?" "No." She shook her head gently. "I expect you to believe guilt can become responsibility." That line stayed with me. Because it sounded exactly like something my father would create for himself. A moral contract instead of emotional honesty. Was Caleb his son? No. The answer arrived instantly. Firm. Certain. I stared at her. "You're sure?" "Yes." Relief hit me so suddenly I almost hated myself for feeling it. Because the emotional math changed immediately. This wasn't a hidden affair, child. It was somehow stranger than that. Then why the secrecy? Marlene looked toward the window. "Because your father believed helping us would destroy the image your family had of him." That sounds narcissistic. Your father spent his whole life terrified of disappointing people. I almost laughed. He disappointed people constantly. "Yes," she said softly, "but never publicly." That shut me up. A car door slammed outside. Marlene glanced toward the driveway. "He's home early." My stomach tightened unexpectedly. The front door opened seconds later. Footsteps. Then a tall man entered the kitchen carrying grocery bags. Late 20s now. Broader shoulders than the photographs. Same smile. Except it disappeared immediately when he saw me. "Caleb," Marlene said carefully, "this is Elena." He looked between us. Slowly understanding. Not the full truth, but enough. "You're from his family," he said. Not a question. I nodded once. He placed the grocery bags on the counter carefully. No hostility. No awkward greeting either. Just visible caution. He died, Caleb said quietly. Yes. I figured. He rubbed one hand against his jaw. She cried all morning yesterday. Marlene looked embarrassed by that. I'm sorry, he added awkwardly. The sincerity in his voice hit harder than anger would have. Thank you, I said. Caleb opened the refrigerator silently, then paused. He loved you guys a lot, you know. I looked at him sharply. You barely knew him. That sounded cruel the second it left my mouth. But Caleb didn't react defensively. He came here for 20 years, he said simply. I knew him enough. I looked away first. Because deep down I suddenly feared he might have known parts of my father I never did. Marlene poured coffee into 3 mismatched mugs. One blue, one white, one dark green. My breath caught slightly when she handed me the green one. It was identical to the mug my father used every morning at home. Same chipped handle. Same faded ceramic glaze. She noticed my expression immediately. He bought 2, she said quietly. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug without speaking. And for the first time since opening the safe deposit box, anger gave way to something far more dangerous. Confusion. I listened to the tape at 2:17 in the morning. Not because I felt ready. Because I couldn't avoid it anymore. The house was completely silent except for the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Snow tapped lightly against the windows. I sat alone at the dining table with the cassette recorder in front of me. My father's voice began almost immediately. No introduction. No hesitation. Elena always hated unnecessary build-up. I closed my eyes for a second. Even dead, he still sounded composed. Like a man chairing a meeting. I imagine by now you've met Marlene. A pause. And Caleb. I didn't move. If you're angry, you should be. That surprised me enough to sit back slightly. Because my father almost never admitted fault directly. Not in life. Certainly not to me. The tape crackled softly. I spent most of my adult life believing stability mattered more than honesty. His breathing shifted slightly near the microphone. I told myself that protecting appearances protected the family. Another pause. It was easier than admitting I didn't know how to be emotionally close to anyone. I stared at the dark kitchen window. My reflection looked older somehow. Tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. You probably think this story is about another woman. A faint sound in the background, papers moving maybe. It isn't. His voice softened slightly then. Not warm. Just less controlled. When Marlene got sick, I made a choice I never explained to your mother. I felt my chest tighten immediately. Not because of betrayal. Because he said your mother instead of mom. Formal language. Distance. Even now. She knew I was helping financially. She did not know the extent. I pressed my fingers against my lips. She asked me once if there was someone else. A long silence followed. And somehow that silence hurt more than words. I let her believe there might be. I stopped breathing for a second. Not because of infidelity. Because suddenly I understood the cruelty of that decision. My mother spent years quietly wondering whether she had failed as a wife. And my father allowed it. To protect himself from emotional exposure. The tape hissed softly. Your mother valued certainty, he continued. I valued control. I looked down at the table. My hands had started shaking. She deserved better communication than I gave her. Not love. Not affection. Communication. Even his guilt remained carefully organized. Then his voice changed again. More personal somehow. And you deserved more from me than achievement. That sentence landed directly in my chest. I didn't realize how badly I still needed him to say it. Even now. Even after death. I looked away from the tape recorder like eye contact still mattered. You were always the strongest one. I laughed quietly under my breath. A bitter sound. There it was. The family mythology. Strong daughter. Independent daughter. The child who supposedly needed less. I convinced myself your independence meant resilience. Another pause. It didn't. My throat tightened painfully. You stopped asking me for comfort very young. Because you never gave it. The thought came instantly. Sharp enough to hurt. But he kept speaking before I could settle inside the anger. I noticed every time. That broke something in me. Not loudly. Quietly. Like ice cracking beneath weight that had existed too long. He noticed. All those years. Every awkward dinner. Every distant holiday. Every careful conversation that felt more professional than parental. He noticed. And allowed it anyway. I stood suddenly and walked toward the sink. Not to do anything. Just movement. I couldn't sit still anymore. The tape continued behind me. I respected competence because competence made people predictable. His voice sounded tired now. Older than I remembered. You frightened me sometimes, Elena. I turned back slowly. You saw through people faster than the others. I leaned against the counter. You asked emotional questions I didn't know how to answer. The refrigerator hummed softly beside me. Outside, snow continued falling. I suddenly remembered being 12 years old asking my father if he ever got lonely traveling for work. He looked confused by the question. Then bought me ice cream instead of answering. At the time, I thought that counted as affection. Maybe it was the closest thing he knew. I thought success compensated for emotional absence, he said. Another long pause. I was wrong. I closed my eyes immediately. Because hearing those words from him felt almost unbearable. Not satisfying. Not healing. Just devastatingly late? The tape clicked softly before continuing. Evelyn wanted me to tell you everything years ago. That surprised me. She understood people better than I did. A faint breath. She usually does. Despite myself, I smiled weakly. Because that sounded exactly like Evelyn. Quietly perceptive. Always underestimated. I asked her to wait until after my death because I knew you would listen differently without me in the room. That made me angry again instantly. Even his confession involved strategy. Control. Timing. Emotional management. You inherited your mother's emotional instincts, he continued, and my talent for distance. I sat back down slowly. That line felt too accurate to dismiss. Because lately I had started noticing it myself. The carefulness. The emotional restraint. The habit of replacing vulnerability with competence. Maybe generational damage didn't arrive dramatically. Maybe it moved quietly through families disguised as personality. The tape crackled again. Then his voice lowered. There's one thing I need you to understand clearly. I leaned closer without meaning to. I never loved Caleb more than you. My stomach tightened. But he needed me visibly. The words hung there. Heavy. Terrible. I believed you would survive without softness. Tears finally slid down my face. Not explosive crying. Silent. Exhausted. Because that sentence explained almost my entire childhood. The pressure. The emotional distance. The endless expectation to perform maturity before I understood what maturity even was. Strong children became emotional storage units in families like ours. Reliable. Self-managing. Convenient. My father inhaled slowly on the tape. And the terrible thing is, a pause. I was proud of you for it. I covered my mouth immediately. Because suddenly I couldn't breathe properly. Not from rage. Recognition. I had spent half my adult life attracting emotionally unavailable people while secretly calling it independence. I learned the pattern at home. The realization settled over me slowly. Cold. Precise. Final. The tape continued for another few minutes. Financial instructions. Legal clarifications. Apologies wrapped carefully inside practical language. But emotionally, the damage had already landed. Then near the end, his voice softened one final time. I know this recording may destroy the image you had of me. I stared at the tape recorder. The strange thing was it hadn't. Not exactly. It had done something worse. It made him human. Flawed. Fearful. Emotionally limited. Not evil. Just painfully incomplete. And somehow that complexity hurt more than simple betrayal ever could. The tape clicked once. Then stopped. The silence afterward felt enormous. I sat there for a long time without moving. Finally, I picked up my phone and called Evelyn. She answered on the second ring. You listened to it, she said quietly. Not a question. Yes. A pause. Then I asked the only thing that mattered anymore. How long did you know? I heard her exhale softly into the phone. Long enough to become tired. I looked down at my father's handwriting still visible on the cassette label. For Elena only. I think he loved us, I whispered. Evelyn's voice nearly broke then. Oh, he did. Another pause. That was the problem. The memorial dinner happened 8 days after the funeral. Long enough for everyone to resume functioning. Not long enough for anyone to process anything honestly. Daniel hosted it at his house in Upper Arlington because his dining room seated 12 comfortably. My father would have appreciated the symmetry of the table placement and the expensive restraint of the furniture. Everything in Daniel's house looked selected for resale value. Neutral walls. Dark hardwood floors. Framed abstract art nobody actually cared about. His wife Rebecca moved through the kitchen carrying trays of food with controlled efficiency. The kind women develop after years of hosting emotionally complicated gatherings. Her smile looked tired before guests even arrived. You okay? She asked quietly while handing me a wine glass. Not really. She nodded once. Yeah. No fake reassurance. I appreciated that. By 6:30, the house filled with relatives, neighbors, and 2 men from my father's investment firm. Apparently, they had become unofficial guardians of his legacy. People kept lowering their voices when discussing finances, which only made everything sound more transactional. Evelyn arrived last. Dark coat. Simple pearl earrings. No makeup except lipstick. She looked steadier than she had at the funeral. Not happier. Just done pretending fragility for other people's comfort. Daniel kissed her cheek. You need anything? No, sweetheart. Sweetheart. Interesting. My father rarely used affectionate language. Evelyn noticed me watching her, then looked away first. The dining room slowly settled into performance. Polite conversation. Controlled grief. Stories polished into acceptable versions. My father's golf handicap somehow became a 15-minute discussion between 2 men who barely visited him while he was alive. I sat quietly near the end of the table listening. Observing. Not participating. That had always been my role in family settings. The watcher. The emotionally literate one nobody wanted naming things aloud. Rebecca placed roast chicken near the center of the table. Okay, she said softly, everybody eat before this gets cold. Silverware moved. Wine poured. For several minutes, normality almost succeeded. Then one of the firm partners cleared his throat. There'll probably be some transitional decisions regarding Richard's client accounts. There it was. Not even halfway through dinner. Daniel straightened slightly. We're handling everything carefully. I know, the man said quickly. Your father built tremendous trust in the community. Built. Not earned. Interesting word choice again. Evelyn dabbed her napkin lightly against her mouth. He also built a tremendous amount of emotional confusion, she said calmly. The room went silent immediately. Rebecca lowered her fork slowly. Daniel blinked. Evelyn. No, she interrupted gently. I'm tired. Nobody moved. She looked toward me briefly, then back at the table. Your father spent his entire life protecting appearances. One of the firm partners shifted uncomfortably. Daniel forced a small laugh. I don't think tonight's the night for philosophical debates. This isn't philosophy. Evelyn's voice stayed perfectly level. That's what makes it unpleasant. My pulse started rising immediately, because suddenly I understood what she was doing. Not losing control. Handing it over. To me. Daniel looked between us now, slowly realizing something had changed without him. Elena, he said carefully, what's going on? I looked down at my plate, then at my brother, 39 years old, still carrying our father's posture in his shoulders, still trying to stabilize rooms before emotions disrupted them. For one painful second I almost protected him. Old instincts. Then I remembered the tape. You stopped asking me for comfort very young. I set my wine glass down carefully. There's something you should know about Dad. Rebecca looked away immediately. Smart woman. She understood impact before details. Daniel frowned slightly. What kind of something? I didn't answer right away. The silence itself became part of the truth. Finally, I spoke. He financially supported another household for almost 20 years. Nobody reacted immediately. The words needed time. One of the firm partners actually stopped chewing. Daniel laughed once. A short, confused sound. What? I held his stare. I found documents in a private safe deposit box. Rebecca slowly placed her napkin onto the table. Evelyn said nothing. Daniel's face changed gradually. Confusion first. Then disbelief. Then something far more vulnerable. Embarrassment. In what sense supported, he asked quietly. Medical bills, housing, tuition? Number. Yes. No. He shook his head harder now. You misunderstood something. I almost admired how quickly denial arrived. The human brain protected identity with astonishing speed. He admitted it himself, I said. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Daniel looked toward her instantly. You knew. She didn't answer fast enough. That was answer enough. Rebecca whispered softly under her breath. Oh my God. Daniel stood abruptly from the table. Chair scraping hardwood. No. He looked physically unsteady now. Anger trying to organize itself around humiliation. How long? Evelyn folded her hands carefully. Years. You knew for years? Yes. And nobody thought maybe his children deserved honesty. The word children sounded strange coming from a grown man. But grief reduces people quickly. Back toward younger versions of themselves. He believed secrecy protected the family, Evelyn said quietly. Daniel laughed sharply. That's insane. Yes, she replied. It was. One of the partners finally stood. Perhaps this conversation should remain private. I looked directly at him. It became private 20 years ago, that's the issue. He sat back down immediately. Good. Daniel ran both hands through his hair. Was there another kid? I hesitated. Not his biologically. Jesus Christ. Rebecca stood then. Not dramatically. Just practical movement toward the kitchen. Because someone needed air. Or distance. Or both. Daniel looked at me again. You met them? Yes. And I thought carefully before answering. They weren't what I expected. That landed strangely around the table. Because everyone realized they had imagined the same stereotype. Mistress. Affair. Second family. Simple betrayal. Reality was emotionally messier. Daniel stared at the floor. Then finally asked the question underneath everything else. Did he love them more? The room became painfully quiet. I thought about the tape. He needed me visibly. I looked at my brother. My exhausted, emotionally cornered brother. And for the first time in years, I saw the child underneath him too. Dad had damaged all of us differently. No, I said softly. That's not what this was. Daniel looked up slowly. Then what was it? I almost answered immediately. Then stopped. Because I suddenly realized the truth was more devastating than infidelity. Our father hadn't betrayed the family because he lacked love. He betrayed us because he lacked emotional courage. And people rarely discuss that kind of damage openly. It was about control, I said finally. Evelyn looked at me carefully. I continued. He thought managing emotions was the same thing as protecting people. Daniel sank slowly back into his chair. Rebecca returned quietly from the kitchen but didn't sit yet. Nobody touched their food anymore. One of the firm partners cleared his throat awkwardly. I'm sure Richard had complicated reasons. I looked at him. No, I said calmly. He had simple fears. That shut the room down completely. Because suddenly my father no longer sounded exceptional. Just human. Painfully human. Daniel stared at the untouched dinner table for a long time. Then spoke so quietly I almost missed it. I used to think he respected me. The sentence broke my heart a little. Because I understood what he really meant. I used to think he knew me. Nobody answered him. Not even Evelyn. Sometimes silence tells the truth more honestly than comfort does. Later that night, after most guests left, Rebecca touched my arm near the doorway. You know what's strange, she whispered. What? She glanced toward Daniel upstairs. I think everyone in this family already felt something was wrong. I looked back at the empty dining room. The untouched food. The abandoned wine glasses, the carefully maintained image finally cracking apart. And for the first time since opening the safe deposit box, I realized exposure was not the same thing as revenge. Sometimes truth simply removes the effort required to keep pretending. 3 days after the dinner, Daniel showed up at my house with coffee and a box of old photographs. No warning. No emotional speech. Just a quiet knock at 8:30 on a Thursday morning. I opened the door wearing sweatpants and one sock. He held up the coffee tray slightly. I come bearing caffeine and unresolved childhood issues. I laughed before I could stop myself. That felt new. Not happiness exactly, but movement. I let him inside. The photographs sat between us on the kitchen table for almost 20 minutes before either of us touched them. Daniel kept stirring cream into his coffee long after it dissolved. Nervous habit. Dad used to do the same thing. I noticed it immediately, then hated myself for noticing. "You've barely answered my texts," he said finally. I didn't know what to say. Same. Silence settled. Not hostile this time. Just honest. Daniel opened the photo box slowly. Most came from family vacations. Disney. Lake Michigan. Christmas mornings in matching pajamas our mother insisted on buying until I was 15 and furious about it. Dad appeared in almost every picture. Present physically. Slightly removed emotionally. Always smiling politely at the camera. Never messy. Never spontaneous. Never fully there. Daniel picked up one beach photo from 1998. "You remember this trip?" I nodded. Mom got sun poisoning. And Dad spent half the vacation taking work calls. We both smiled faintly. Then stopped smiling at almost the same moment. Because suddenly the memory didn't feel funny anymore. It felt explanatory. Daniel leaned back in the chair. "I keep replaying things." "Me too. I don't even know what's real now." That sentence sat heavily between us. Because that was the true damage of secrets. Not the information itself. The erosion of trust in your own memories. I looked down at a photo of my father teaching Daniel how to grill burgers. "You know what bothers me most?" I asked quietly. Daniel shook his head. He probably thought he was a good father. Daniel stared at me for several seconds. Then slowly nodded. Yeah. That agreement hurt more than anger would have. Because neither of us believed our father acted maliciously. Intentional cruelty would have simplified things. Instead, we inherited something far more complicated. A man who loved responsibility more easily than vulnerability. Daniel rubbed his jaw slowly. "Rebecca thinks I'm becoming obsessed. She's probably worried about you." "I know." He looked tired suddenly. "Older. Marriage, kids, career, grief, family collapse. Middle age arrives quietly for most people. Then all at once." "I snapped at Ethan yesterday," he admitted. "My nephew. 10 years old. Sensitive kid. What happened?" He spilled orange juice on my laptop bag. Daniel laughed softly at himself. I reacted like he'd committed fraud. I didn't answer immediately. Because I recognized the pattern. Pressure transferring downward. Emotional inheritance disguised as personality. Daniel stared into his coffee. Afterward, he apologized 3 times. That sentence hit both of us hard. I looked away first. Because suddenly I remembered apologizing constantly as a child, too. Not for wrongdoing. For emotional inconvenience. My father rarely yelled. That was the confusing part. He simply withdrew warmth when disappointed. Silence became punishment. Approval became currency. Children learn quickly under systems like that. "You ever feel like we were always being evaluated?" I asked quietly. Daniel looked up instantly. Yes. No hesitation. No confusion. Just immediate recognition. And somehow that validation nearly broke me. Because families like ours survive through emotional isolation. Everyone privately thinks they imagined the tension. Then adulthood arrives. And suddenly siblings start comparing invisible bruises. Daniel exhaled slowly. I thought he respected me because I followed his rules. "You did." "Yeah." He looked toward the window. Turns out he was just more comfortable with predictability. That sounded painfully accurate. We sat quietly for a while, sorting photographs into loose piles. "Mom, Vacations. Christmases. School events. Tiny archaeological pieces of emotional history. Then Daniel picked up one photo and froze. I noticed immediately. What? He handed it to me. Dad sat beside me at my college graduation dinner. I remembered the restaurant instantly. Steakhouse downtown. Rain outside. Dad arriving 40 minutes late from a client meeting. At the time I told myself successful men worked hard. Now I noticed something else entirely. He looked terrified. Not unhappy. Not angry. Anxious. His hand gripped the edge of the table tightly enough for the knuckles to pale. What are you seeing? I asked. Daniel pointed carefully. He's uncomfortable because you were crying. I stared at the photo again. He was right. My eyes looked red from emotion. Dad looked trapped by it. The realization moved through me slowly. Our father wasn't emotionally withholding because he enjoyed power. He was emotionally withholding because intimacy overwhelmed him. That didn't excuse the damage. But it changed the shape of it. Daniel stood eventually and wandered toward the living room shelves. His eyes landed on the cassette tape sitting beside a framed photo of Mom. You still listening to it? Sometimes. Why? I thought about that carefully. Because the answer mattered. Because hearing him admit it makes me feel less crazy. Daniel nodded slowly. That made sense to him too. Before leaving, he paused near the doorway. You think people can love their kids and still hurt them permanently? I crossed my arms loosely. I think that happens constantly. He absorbed that quietly. Then smiled sadly. You sound like a therapist. I sound expensive. That made him laugh properly. A real laugh. Maybe the first real one since the funeral. After he left, I drove to Evelyn's townhouse. Not planned. Instinctive. She answered the door wearing reading glasses and holding unopened mail. You look better, she said immediately. So do you. That's because I finally stopped lying for someone. Fair point. She invited me inside. The townhouse smelled faintly like lavender and old books. Soft jazz played quietly from another room. For years I thought Evelyn lacked emotional depth because she remained so calm around my father. Now I wondered whether calmness had simply been survival. We sat near the fireplace with tea neither of us touched much. I owe you an apology, I said eventually. Evelyn looked surprised. For what? I judged you for years. A small smile touched her face. You were supposed to. I frowned slightly. What does that mean? Your father preferred complicated women who appeared emotionally manageable. That sounded exactly like him. I thought you were passive, I admitted. Evelyn laughed softly. Oh, Elena. She removed her glasses slowly. Staying married to your father required Olympic-level emotional strategy. I smiled despite myself. Then her expression softened. He loved you very much. I looked down immediately. I know. The strange thing was I finally did. Not because of what he gave. Because of what he failed to give. Love distorted by fear still leaves fingerprints behind. Even damaged love shapes people. Evelyn studied me quietly across the room. You know, she said softly, your father envied you. I looked up sharply. Me. You say uncomfortable truths out loud. She folded one leg beneath herself. He spent his entire life avoiding that. Outside, evening snow drifted across the streetlights. Inside, the fire crackled softly between us. And for the first time since my father died, I stopped trying to decide whether he had been good or bad. People were rarely that simple. The harder question was whether understanding someone reduced the damage they caused. I still didn't know. But I was finally willing to ask it honestly. 2 weeks after my visit with Evelyn, I found the final note tucked inside the cassette case. I almost missed it. A single folded sheet pressed beneath the plastic liner. My father's handwriting covered only half the page. Short sentences. No financial instructions. No controlled language. Just honesty stripped down to its smallest form. If you are reading this calmly, then you survived me better than I survived myself. I sat very still after reading that line. Morning light spilled across my kitchen table. Snow had finally melted outside, leaving wet sidewalks and small patches of exhausted grass along the curb. Ordinary March weather. Ordinary suburban silence. Nothing about the morning looked dramatic enough for emotional closure. Maybe that was appropriate. Real families rarely healed in cinematic moments. Mostly they adjusted quietly. One uncomfortable truth at a time. I read the note again. I spent years believing providing stability was the same thing as love. I understand now those are not the same gift. The handwriting looked shakier near the bottom. I wanted my children to admire me. I should have focused on letting them know me instead. I closed my eyes. Not because the words fixed anything. Because they didn't. That was the strange relief of adulthood. Eventually, you stop waiting for perfect apologies. You begin accepting partial truths from imperfect people. And somehow that becomes enough to keep living. Later that afternoon, I drove to the cemetery alone. The ground remained damp from melted snow. Thin clouds covered most of the sky, turning the afternoon pale and colorless. My father's grave still looked temporary. Fresh dirt. Artificial green matting. Flowers beginning to wilt at the edges. I stood there for several minutes without speaking. Not dramatic silence. Just uncertainty. For most of my life, conversations with my father required preparation. Even internally. You edited yourself before speaking. Filtered emotion before expression. I realized suddenly that I was still doing it. Even now. Even standing over his grave. I laughed softly at the absurdity of that. Then finally sat down on the cold folding chair beside the headstone. You really made a mess of things, I said quietly. Wind moved through nearby trees. Somewhere farther across the cemetery, workers spoke to each other near a maintenance cart. Normal sounds? Life continuing. I think you loved us, I admitted after a while. The sentence felt heavier spoken aloud. Just not in ways that made people feel safe. My throat tightened slightly. I looked down at the note in my hands. You know what the worst part is? A long pause. I understand you now. That hurt more than anger ever had. Because understanding creates responsibility. Once you recognize where emotional damage comes from, you have to decide whether to repeat it. I thought about Daniel snapping at Ethan. About myself withdrawing from relationships whenever intimacy became unpredictable. About my mother translating silence into loyalty for almost 30 years. Generational tension rarely arrives screaming. Usually it enters quietly through habits mistaken for personality. I heard footsteps behind me then. Slow. Measured. I didn't need to turn around. Evelyn sat beside me without speaking. Dark wool coat. Leather gloves folded neatly in her lap. For a while we simply looked at the grave together. You found the last note, she said eventually. I nodded. You knew about it. He wrote it 2 weeks before he died. Her voice sounded tired. Not emotionally tired. Soul tired. Like someone who had spent decades carrying another person's unfinished emotional work. I almost threw it away, she admitted softly. I looked at her. Why didn't you? Because despite everything. She paused carefully. He was trying. Late, but trying. I looked back at the headstone. Richard Whitmore, 1949 to 2026. So little information for an entire human life. You stayed with him a long time, I said. Evelyn smiled faintly. Yes. Why? She thought about it seriously before answering. Because he was kinder than people realized. I frowned slightly. That's hard for me to reconcile. I know. She looked down at her gloves. Your father was emotionally selfish in intimate relationships, but he was deeply compassionate toward strangers. Marlene. Caleb. Hospital bills. Tuition payments. Suddenly it made painful sense. Helping strangers required no vulnerability. Loving family honestly did. Evelyn crossed one leg slowly. He grew up in a house where weakness was punished immediately, she said quietly. By the time I met him, emotional control was the only survival skill he trusted. I stared ahead silently. Again, not excuse. Context? Adults spend years learning the difference. After a while, Evelyn touched the edge of the folded note in my hand. He wanted you to inherit the truth, she said. Not the money. A sad smile crossed her face. He knew money was the least interesting thing about him. I almost laughed. My father would have hated that sentence. Then again, maybe not. Maybe somewhere near the end he finally understood himself more honestly too. We sat there another 20 minutes talking quietly about ordinary things. My mother's terrible cooking experiments in the 90s. Dad's obsession with weather forecasts. The fact he ironed socks during periods of stress. Tiny human details. Not myths, not legacy. Just fragments of a flawed man. Eventually, Evelyn stood first. Her knees cracked slightly when she straightened. "Age is humiliating," she muttered. That made me smile. Before leaving, she hesitated beside the chair. "You know," she said carefully, "you don't have to forgive him completely." I looked up at her. "That's good, because I don't." Evelyn nodded once. "Neither do I." Then she squeezed my shoulder gently and walked back toward the parking lot. I stayed behind another few minutes alone. The cemetery had grown quieter now. Late afternoon light stretched across the grass in long gray bands. I removed the cassette tape from my coat pocket slowly. For Elena only. I turned it over once in my hands, then placed it carefully against the base of the headstone. Not as punishment. Not as closure either. Just acknowledgement. Some truths belong to the dead after they've finally been spoken. Before leaving, I rested my fingers briefly against the cold granite. And for the first time in my life, I stopped trying to earn love from someone emotionally incapable of giving it fully. That realization didn't feel triumphant. It felt peaceful. If this story touched something in your own life, maybe take a moment today to tell the people you love who you really are before silence turns into inheritance.